The slime was a second skin on the world, a glistening gray lacquer over fence posts and doorsteps, over the tender leaves of what had been, a week ago, Martha Gable's prize-winning cabbages. Now they were lacework ghosts, melting back into the mud under a relentless, patient assault. Martha stood at Alara's gate, her face a ruin of sleeplessness and despair. Her own garden, her pride and her larder for the coming winter, was a slick, gray graveyard. Beyond the gate, however, the world changed. It was as if a line had been drawn in the soil by God himself. On Martha's side, ruin. On Alara's side, a wall of impossible green. The leaves of squash plants were broad and unchewed. The beans climbed their poles with defiant vigor, and the cabbages were tight, perfect globes of pale green, dewy with evening moisture, not with ooze. There was no slime. Not a single glistening trail marred the dark, rich earth. Martha's gaze, frantic and begging, was not on the vegetables. It was on the sentinels. A phalanx of 76 mud-colored ducks, waddling with the comic dignity of tiny, self-important landowners, patrolled the perimeter. They moved with a purpose that defied their shambling gait, their heads dipping and rising in a steady rhythm, their bills making soft, decisive clicks in the twilight. They were the reason. They were the miracle. "Please," Martha Gable whispered, a word stripped of all her usual pride. She had been one of the loudest scoffers. "Just for a night. I'll pay." She looked from Alara's calm, tired face to the impossible Eden behind her, and then back again. Hunger changes a town, but desperation changes a person even faster. It strips away mockery and leaves only the raw, aching need. Alara looked at the woman who had laughed at her in the street, at the ducks now moving like a slow, feathered river in the dusk, and felt not triumph, but a deep, resonant weariness. The arithmetic of this moment was simple: one woman's foresight against a whole town's blindness. One woman's foolishness, now revealed as the only wisdom that mattered. It was not a pleasant calculation. 6 months earlier, there had been no thought of plagues or ruin, only of beginnings. Alara had arrived in the town of Prosperity Flats with little more than a deed to a patch of land and a stubborn set of shoulders. The land itself was the town's longest-running joke. 20 acres of low-lying bottomland that flooded every spring and stayed damp until the first hard frost. The Bottoms, they called it. Mr. Silas Croft, the grain merchant and the town's self-appointed arbiter of good sense, had sold it to her himself, his face a careful mask of professional concern. "A young woman alone," he'd said, leaning on the counter of his emporium, the scent of milled flour and his own bay rum pomade thick in the air. "It's a hard piece of ground, miss. You'd have done better to take a room in town, find some work as a seamstress." His smile was meant to be kind, but it was the smile of a man who had just sold a lame horse to a blind man and was congratulating himself on his charity. Alara had just nodded, her signature stillness already a source of irritation for the townsfolk. She paid in cash, the bills worn soft from years of being saved, and took the deed. She didn't explain that the waterlogged soil was precisely why she'd wanted it. She had walked every inch of it, her boots sinking into the muck, feeling the land's quiet, sodden pulse. She saw not a swamp, but a sponge, a place that held water when all else was cracked and dry. She saw the cattails and the reeds, and understood it was a language the high, dry farms had forgotten how to speak. The town's verdict was swift and merciless. They saw a fool, a girl with more savings than sense, who had bought the one thing nobody else wanted. Then she made it worse. At the spring livestock auction, after the fine wool sheep and the strong-backed oxen had been sold, the auctioneer had tried to move the last lot. "All right, folks, what am I bid for this flock?" He gestured to a hastily assembled pen of the most miserable-looking ducks Alara had ever seen. They weren't the proud white Pekins or the handsome Rouens. They were a motley collection of an indeterminate breed, the color of ditch water and mud, with skinny necks and an air of profound existential gloom. 76 of them, to be exact. They came with the Miller place, the auctioneer explained, with no enthusiasm. "Good for, well," their ducks, a ripple of laughter went through the crowd. "Good for chasing off your last friend," someone called from the back. "They'll eat you out of house and home and give you nothing but noise for your trouble," another added. When Alara placed a bid, A low, quiet offer that was barely more than the cost of a sack of flour. A hush fell. The auctioneer, eager to be done, slammed his gavel before anyone else could think to object. Sold. To the young lady in the gray dress. All 76 of them. The laughter that followed her back to her wagon was not kind. It was the laughter of a community confirming its own judgment. Silas Croft caught her eye, a flicker of something sharp and assessing in his gaze before it was replaced by pitying amusement. He tipped his hat. That night, as she herded the confused, squawking birds onto her new property, the weight of that laughter settled on her. One person alone. 76 skinny ducks. 20 acres of mud. She sat on her porch step in the dark, listening to the peepers and the confused quacking from the makeshift pen. In the dark, she began the arithmetic. The cost of the land. The cost of the ducks. The amount left for seed and tools and salt. It was a stark and unforgiving sum, but it did not make her despair. It simply made her adjust. She would have to be smarter. She would have to be more patient. And she would have to prove them all wrong. The first few weeks were a blur of methodical, back-breaking labor. The mockery from the town settled into a kind of background hum, like the drone of summer insects. It was there when she went to the general store for nails, and the men on the porch would fall silent. Then one would quack softly, setting off a new round of snickers. It was there in the pitying looks from the women at the church social, who offered her advice on mending or cooking, but never on farming. They had already decided her farm was a failure. Alara met it all with the same unnerving stillness. Being right is its own kind of reply, and she was not yet ready to give it. Her only real companion in those early days was old man Gerhardt, an immigrant from a country no one could quite place, who lived in a small, neat cabin on the ridge overlooking the bottoms. He had a formidable accent and hands as gnarled as ancient roots. He did not mock her. The first time he saw her digging a series of shallow, interconnected trenches across her land, he simply came down the hill, leaned on the fence, and watched for a solid hour. Alara, sweat-drenched and mud-caked, kept working. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble. The water, she wants to move. You are giving her a path. Alara straightened up, wiping her forehead with the back of a muddy hand. She'll drown the garden beds otherwise. Yeah, he said, nodding slowly. Good. But you listen with your hands. You must also listen with your feet. He stomped his boot on the damp ground. The land tells you what it needs. This land, she is thirsty even when she is wet. She wants to hold, not just to flow. The high ground gives everything away. This ground, she keeps secrets Alara didn't fully understand, but she felt the truth in his words. He became a quiet fixture at the edge of her property. He taught her, without seeming to teach, how to read the color of the mud, how to tell by the slant of the reeds where the deepest water lay. He never once mentioned the ducks in a negative light. He just watched them, a small, thoughtful smile on his face. They are busy, he'd say. Always busy. Her other visitor was Finn, a boy of about 10 with hair the color of straw and eyes that missed nothing. He was from the shantier end of town, one of a dozen children in a family that was always one step ahead of hunger. The other boys threw rocks at her ducks. Finn just watched them from the road, his expression one of intense, silent concentration. One day, Alara was trying to herd the flock into a new pen, and the birds, being contrary creatures, were scattering in every possible direction. Finn, without a word, slipped through the fence, picked up a long fallen branch, and began to gently guide the stragglers back toward the group, mimicking the low, encouraging noises Alara was making. Together, they got the flock moved in half the time. Alara straightened up and looked at the boy. He looked back, ready to bolt if she yelled. Instead, she said, they seem to listen to you. A slow grin spread across Finn's face. They're not so bad, he said. Just noisy from then on. Finn was a permanent part of the farm. He arrived before school and came back the moment it was done. He had a preternatural gift for understanding the ducks. He learned to identify individual birds, giving them names based on their personalities: Boss, Waddles, Grumpy, and a particularly loud one he called the Preacher. Alara paid him not in coin, which she barely had, but in food, a hot meal at midday, and in purpose. She taught him the arithmetic. If we want to build a new coop, we need 10 long boards and 20 short ones. That costs money. The ducks give us eggs. So we have to figure out how many eggs we need to sell to buy the boards. She would draw the figures in the dirt with a stick, and Finn would follow along, his brow furrowed in concentration. For the first time, the numbers weren't about what his family lacked, but about what they could build. The town saw a foolish girl, a half-wild boy, and a flock of useless ducks. They didn't see the silent lessons, the growing trust, or the slow, steady rhythm of work that was beginning to transform a patch of mud into a functioning farm. By June, the rhythm of the farm had settled into a steady cadence, dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. Alara and Finn worked from before dawn until the light failed. They finished the network of shallow canals, guiding the excess water away from the areas she designated for planting and into a larger, deeper pond at the lowest point of the property. This, Silas Croft had declared to the men at the feed store, was her crowning folly. "She's digging her own swamp," he'd boomed, to appreciative laughter. "First she buys the swamp. Now she's making it swampier." Alara heard the story repeated back to her by the store owner's wife, offered as a piece of friendly, concerned gossip. Alara just nodded and bought a new spool of twine. She and Finn had used the soil they dug from the canals to build raised garden beds, mounded high and dark and rich, safe from the casual dampness of the ground. Into these beds went the seeds, cabbage and kale, beans and squash, tomatoes and potatoes. The work was methodical. Day after day after day, they hauled dirt, amended it with rotted leaves and the rich muck scraped from the bottom of the old pond, and shaped the beds. Alara's hands, once pale and soft, became calloused and strong, the nails permanently rimmed with dirt. She had never felt more alive. The ducks were a constant, chaotic, and surprisingly helpful presence. Once she let them out of their initial pen, they claimed the entire 20 acres as their domain. They dabbled in the new canals, keeping the water moving. They snoozed in muddy puddles under the hot afternoon sun. And they ate. They ate everything. They ate weeds and roots and submerged grasses. They ate bugs and worms and things Alara couldn't identify. Their 76 bodies were a constant engine of consumption, their heads perpetually down, their bills sifting the rich, wet earth. Finn became the official duck commander. He learned their patterns, their favorite wallows, their squabbles and alliances. The flock, which had seemed an undifferentiated mass of brown, resolved into a complex society. He could move them from one side of the property to the other with a series of low calls and whistles, a skill that left Alara quietly amazed. At night, Alara would sit at her small kitchen table, a single candle pushing back the dark. The arithmetic continued. She counted the cost of seed against the potential yield of the garden. She tallied the number of fence posts they still needed. But now a new number entered the equation. The ducks, fattening on the land's free bounty, had started to lay. At first it was just a few eggs, found in nests hidden in the tall reeds. They were smaller than a chicken's egg, and their shells had a strange, greenish-blue tint. The townsfolk would have surely called them worthless. Alara washed one carefully and cracked it into a hot skillet. The yolk was a deep, fiery orange, and the white was firm and clear. It tasted rich, wild, and utterly delicious. She started collecting them, hiding her growing stash in a cool corner of the cellar. She didn't tell a soul. It was a secret, a private victory, a coal banked low under ash, waiting for the right time to be revealed. One evening, as she and Finn were mending a section of fence, she noticed a peculiar pattern. On one side of the fence, the ground was dotted with the small, glistening trails of slugs and snails, which thrived in the perpetual damp of the bottoms. On the other side, inside the ducks' main foraging area, there were none. The ground was clean. She knelt, her fingers tracing the damp earth. She looked at the ducks, currently engaged in a noisy, splashy convention in the main canal. An idea, sharp and clear as a bird's call in the morning, bloomed in her mind. The next day, she and Finn spent hours herding the entire flock into a temporary pen they built around her newly planted garden beds. The ducks were not pleased. They quacked in protest, their indignation a palpable force. "What are we doing?" Finn asked, confused. "They want to be in the water. We're experimenting," Alara said, her eyes alight with a new kind of intensity. "We're going to see what they're really hungry for." For 3 days, she kept the ducks penned around the garden. At dawn on the 4th day, she opened the gate. The flock did not surge toward their beloved canals. Instead, they poured into the garden beds, a low, wide, waddling tide of brown. And they began to work. Their heads dropped, and a quiet, intense focus descended on the flock. They ignored the tender cabbage leaves. They bypassed the delicate bean sprouts. They moved with the meticulous precision of surgeons, their bills probing and picking, lifting and swallowing. They were eating the slugs. Every single one. They cleaned the beds with a terrifying efficiency, their soft, clicking bills the only sound in the morning air. They moved between the rows, never trampling a single plant, their bodies low to the ground. They were not pests. They were guardians. Alara watched, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm of revelation. This was the secret the land had been keeping. This was the language it spoke. The high, dry farms fought pests with poison and hoe. This low, wet land had its own solution, a self-propelled, self-replicating, 76-part answer to the problem. Old Gerhardt's words came back to her. The land tells you what it needs. Her land didn't need to be drained and conquered. It needed to be understood. It needed its partners. That evening, Alara sat with her ledger, but she wasn't doing the arithmetic of survival anymore. She was doing the arithmetic of symbiosis. Cost of duck feed, nearly zero. Benefit of slug removal, priceless. Bonus, a steady supply of rich, dark-shelled eggs. A new secret to keep. She began to manage the flock with a new purpose. Each morning, she and Finn would guide them to a different section of the farm, letting them patrol the perimeter of the growing fields, cleaning the earth before turning them loose to their own devices in the afternoon. The garden thrived under this new regime. The plants grew with an almost alarming vitality, their leaves broad and glossy, free from the ragged holes that plagued even the best-kept gardens in town. By the third week of June, the secret started to get harder to keep. The ducks were now laying with abandon. Alara had basket after basket of the beautiful, strange-colored eggs. She couldn't eat them all, and Finn's family, though grateful, could only use so many. It was time for the next step. She loaded a single, large basket into her wagon and drove to the neighboring town of Mill Creek, where she was not known as the foolish girl with the mud ducks. She went to the back door of the Gilded Spoon, the finest eating establishment for 50 miles, and asked for the chef. A large, sweaty man with a fearsome mustache and a gravy-stained apron came out, looking annoyed. "What is it?" "I have eggs to sell," Alara said simply, holding up the basket. He scoffed. "I have eggs. From chickens." "Like a normal person, taste one," Alara said. Her calmness was its own kind of challenge. Intrigued despite himself, the chef took an egg. He cracked it. He stared at the deep orange yolk. He grunted. He disappeared back into his kitchen. He returned a few minutes later with a small skillet containing a perfectly fried egg. He took a bite. He chewed. He closed his eyes. Then he opened them and looked at Alara with a completely new expression. "How many of these can you get me?" he asked, his voice low and serious. "And what do you call them?" "Duck eggs," Alara said. "And I can get you as many as you need." She named her price, a fair one, but a firm one. The chef didn't even haggle. He bought the entire basket and placed a standing order for 5 dozen, twice a week. Alara drove home, the coin heavy and real in her pocket. It had worked. The mockery of Prosperity Flats was a distant noise. She had found a market that judged the product, not the person. The secret was still safe, but it was starting to pay. The spring that had been merely damp turned unnaturally wet, then warm. The air grew heavy, thick as a woolen blanket, and the sky took on a permanent, milky gray haze. Old Man Gerhardt would sniff the air, his gaze on the low-hanging clouds, and mutter, "Too much water. No rest for the ground." In town, the gardens flourished. It was the kind of growing season people would talk about for years. The tomatoes were swelling on the vine, the cabbages grew to prodigious sizes, and the squash plants threatened to take over entire yards. There was a smug satisfaction in the air at the general store. This was what good, high, well-drained land could do. Every conversation was a comparison of sizes, a friendly competition of bounty. No one spared a thought for the girl in the bottoms. Her land, surely, must be a complete lake by now. Then, the plague began. It started subtly. A few nibbled leaves. A glistening trail on a porch step in the morning. People blamed cutworms or earwigs. They put out pans of beer and sprinkled ash. It did nothing. The slugs, thriving in the perfect incubator of the warm, wet soil, had exploded in number. They were not the small, familiar garden slugs. These were monsters, some as long as a man's finger, mottled green and black, and they moved with a slow, slimy purpose. Within a week, it was no longer a nuisance. It was a tide. They came out at night, a silent, oozing army that blanketed everything. The cherished gardens of Prosperity Flats became a 24-hour buffet. People woke to find their prize-winning tomato plants stripped bare, the fruit below turned to slimy pulp. Entire rows of beans vanished overnight. The cabbages, once a source of pride, became hollowed-out shells, filled with feasting slugs. Panic began to set in. It was one thing to lose a few plants. It was another to watch your entire winter food supply being devoured before your eyes. The talk at the store turned from smug comparisons to frantic, desperate remedies. Salt. It worked, but it poisoned the soil, and you could never have enough salt to stop 1,000,000 slugs. Copper wire. Too expensive. People were out in their gardens at night with lanterns and buckets, picking the creatures off one by one, a hopeless and disgusting task. They filled barrels with them, but for every one they picked, 100 more seemed to take its place. The sound of the town changed. The confident banter was replaced by the grim, tired talk of a people under siege. Even Silas Croft, usually so buoyant, was heard complaining that his wife's prized roses had been eaten down to thorny sticks. He blamed the weather, the soil, God, anything but the simple fact of nature's unblinking calculus. Through it all, Alara and Finn continued their work. Their world was bounded by the fences of the bottoms, and within those fences, a different reality prevailed. The slugs were there, of course. The wet ground was a paradise for them. But they were not a plague. They were a harvest. Every morning, the ducks, now sleek and heavy, would pour into the garden area, their internal clocks perfectly attuned to the morning feast. They were the perfect predators, a living, waddling, self-regulating system of pest control. Alara's garden was an island, a vibrant, impossible green jewel set in a spreading landscape of gray decay. Her cabbages were firm, her tomatoes hung heavy and red on the vine, her beans were crisp and perfect. She and Finn harvested basket after basket, the abundance almost overwhelming. The cellar shelves began to fill with jars of pickles, beans, and preserved tomatoes. The baskets of eggs for the chef in Mill Creek were joined by crates of perfect vegetables. The money she made was a secret she kept as closely as she had kept the first eggs. She used it to buy better tools, more jars, and a new pair of sturdy boots for Finn, whose old ones were falling apart. The townsfolk, consumed by their own disaster, barely noticed her wagon passing through, laden on the way out, empty on the way back. They were too busy looking at their own ruined soil to see the bounty she was hauling from the land they had all scorned. But they would. Soon, they would have no choice but to look. The tide of slime was still rising, and hunger was beginning to gnaw at the edges of the town's pride. August arrived like the open door of a furnace, baking the slime-coated leaves into a brittle, stinking crust. The slug plague had run its course, having devoured everything there was to eat. The gardens of Prosperity Flats were a wasteland. What the slugs hadn't eaten, the rot that followed had claimed. The smell of decay hung over the town, a constant reminder of the failure. The smugness of early summer had curdled into a brittle, fearful silence. The arithmetic of winter was beginning to dawn on people. With no garden produce to put by, they would be entirely reliant on what they could buy from Mr. Croft's store. Prices, everyone knew, would be high. It was in this atmosphere of quiet desperation that the perception of Alara began to shift. The reversal didn't happen all at once. It began with whispers. A farmer on the way to Mill Creek saw her wagon loaded with crates of what looked like perfect, unblemished vegetables. He mentioned it at the smithy, and it was dismissed as a trick of the light. Then the cook from the Gilded Spoon, during a trip to Croft's Emporium for bulk flour, happened to mention the girl who was supplying him with the finest duck eggs and produce he'd ever seen. That strange girl in the bottoms? Croft asked, his skepticism plain. Her land is a swamp, whatever it is, the cook had said, weighing a sack of beans in his hand. She's growing gold down there. My customers can't get enough of it. The story spread like wildfire. A story of failure is interesting, But a story of impossible success in the face of universal failure is irresistible. People started to make excuses to walk down the road past the bottoms. They wouldn't look directly. They'd pretend to be checking a fence line or admiring the clouds, but their eyes would be drawn, as if by a magnet, to the shocking green of Alara's land. They saw the squash vines, heavy with fruit, spilling over the edges of the raised beds. They saw the rows of kale, dark and lush. They saw the ducks, fat and glossy, patrolling their domain like conquering heroes. The mockery died completely, replaced by a stunned, envious silence. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. The town had invested too much in Alara's failure. To accept her success now meant accepting their own foolishness, their own lack of vision. They couldn't bring themselves to do it. So they watched, and they whispered, and they resented her for being right. Martha Gable, whose garden had been the pride of the county, was the first to break. Her pride had been eaten along with her cabbages. The sight of Alara's perfect vegetables was a constant, bitter torment. The confrontation at the gate was the first crack in the town's wall of silence. And it was a sign to the one man in town who saw every crisis not as a disaster, but as an opportunity. Silas Croft had been watching Alara more closely than anyone. He had dismissed her at first, but the cook's words had planted a seed of curiosity. He'd done his own reconnaissance, riding out to the ridge overlooking the bottoms. What he saw made his merchant's heart beat faster. It wasn't just a garden, it was a monopoly. In a town facing a winter of scarcity, Alara wasn't just growing food. She was growing power. He saw her land not as a farm, but as an asset. The ducks, which he had once laughed at, he now saw as a bizarre but effective production engine. He didn't understand how it worked, and he didn't care. He only understood the result. He let the town's desperation simmer for another week, watching the worried faces that came into his store, listening to the hushed conversations about the price of flour and beans. He let the hunger sharpen. Then, when he judged the moment was right, he put on his best suit, polished his boots, and drove his smart, handsome buggy down the rutted road to the bottoms. He was not coming to buy a basket of vegetables. He was coming to buy it all. Silas Croft arrived late one afternoon, the setting sun glinting off the polished brass of his buggy's lamps. He stopped just outside the gate, taking a moment to compose his face into an expression of friendly concern. He was a master of this expression. He found Alara and Finn loading the last of the day's harvest into the small handcart, their movements tired but efficient. The air smelled of damp earth and green, living things, a stark contrast to the faint scent of decay that still clung to the rest of the valley. "Miss Alara," he called out, his voice booming with false warmth. "A moment of your time. If you please." Alara straightened, her hand going to the small of her back. She watched him approach, her face unreadable. Finn stood slightly behind her, his hand clutching a handful of her skirt, his eyes wary. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice flat. "Quite a setup you have here," Croft said, gesturing expansively at the fields, the canals, the ducks dabbling in the twilight. "Quite a surprise. Who would have thought?" The condescension was still there, woven into the fabric of his praise. A person alone could never manage all this. It must be overwhelming. He was already framing his argument, keying his attack to her perceived weakness. "I've come to help. I'm managing," Alara said. Of course," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "But the town is in a bad way. People are worried. They're hungry. And you have all this." He let the accusation hang in the air for a moment. "It's a great responsibility. Too great for one young woman to bear. The selling, the pricing, the distribution." He said the word as if it were a complex piece of machinery she couldn't possibly understand. "So I have a proposition for you. A simple one. I will buy it all. Every last bean, every last cabbage. The whole harvest." He named a price. It was a large number, more money than Alara had ever seen in one place. It was enough to buy a proper house in town, to live for a year without lifting a finger. But she had done her arithmetic. She knew what her produce was worth, not just in Mill Creek, but here, in a town starved for it. His offer was perhaps a quarter of its real value. He was counting on her being young, alone, and easily dazzled by a pile of cash. He was counting on her being the fool they'd all assumed she was. "I'll take it all off your hands," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "No more work for you. You can rest. I'll see to it that the town gets fed. It's my civic duty. After all, he would see to it. She knew that the town paid 5 times what he was offering her. He wasn't offering to help her. He was offering to buy her monopoly so it could become his own. Alara was silent for a long time. She looked past Croft's shoulder at the road leading back to town. She could see the smoke rising from a few chimneys, people cooking their meager suppers. She thought of Martha Gable's desperate face at the gate. She thought of the laughter in the street, the pitying looks. She could take Croft's money. It would be a kind of victory, a private triumph that would prove them all wrong in the one language. Money, they all understood. She would be rich. She would be gone. And the town would be at the mercy of Silas Croft. She looked down at Finn, who was watching Croft with undisguised dislike. She thought of old Gerhardt's words, about listening with her feet, about the secrets the land keeps. The land had given her this abundance. It felt wrong to sell it like a sack of flour. The food wasn't a commodity. It was the answer to a prayer. It was hope, sitting in baskets. Finally, she looked directly at Silas Croft. Her stillness was no longer passive. It was a force, a wall he could not breach. No, she said. The word was quiet, but it landed with the weight of a stone. Croft's smile faltered. No, my dear girl, I think you misunderstand. I understand perfectly, Mr. Croft, she interrupted, her voice still quiet, but now edged with steel. You want to buy my harvest cheap and sell it dear to your neighbors. My neighbors, she had never called them that before. The food is not for sale. Not to you. Croft's face, for the first time, lost its smooth, patronizing mask. A flicker of anger, hot and real, showed in his eyes. Don't be a fool, girl. What are you going to do with all this? Let it rot in the fields. No, Alara said again. She picked up a basket, one filled to the brim with glossy green beans and plump, red tomatoes. I'm going to sell it. Her gaze went past him, down the road, where a small crowd of onlookers had gathered, drawn by the sight of Croft's buggy and the prospect of drama. Martha Gable was among them, her face a mixture of hope and shame. Tomorrow morning, Alara announced, her voice carrying in the still evening air, I will have a stall in the market square. The prices will be fair. She then turned and walked past the stunned merchant. She went directly to her gate, where Martha Gable stood twisting her apron in her hands. Alara held out the heavy basket. You have children to feed, she said. It was not a question. Martha looked at the basket, then at Alara's face, and her own crumpled. Tears she had been holding back for weeks finally fell. She reached for the basket, her hands trembling. I don't have, I know, Alara said. It's a gift. For the children, it was an act of generosity so simple and so profound that it silenced the entire street. It was not pity. It was not charity. It was neighborliness, a concept the town had almost forgotten. And in that single gesture, Silas Croft was exposed. His talk of civic duty was revealed as the hollow greed it was. He stood alone in the middle of the road, a man in a fine suit who had just been outmaneuvered by a girl in a dirt-stained dress. He saw the looks on the faces of the townsfolk, the dawning comprehension, the flicker of contempt. He had lost. He knew it. Without another word, he climbed back into his fine buggy, his back rigid with fury, and drove away, the sound of his horse's hooves swallowed by the sudden buzz of conversation that erupted in his wake. Alara didn't watch him go. She was already walking back to the cottage, Finn at her side. We have a lot to do before morning, she said, and for the first time, Finn saw her smile. A real smile, not of triumph, but of rightness. The arithmetic had changed once more. It was no longer about profit or survival. It was about community. It was about choosing generosity over greed. And that, Alara was discovering, was the most satisfying calculation of all. The victory wasn't in being right, it was in doing right. That night, a half-dozen shadows appeared at her gate. It was not a threat. It was the husbands and sons of the women who had mocked her. They didn't speak. They just picked up the lanterns she had left out, took the carts, and began to help her and Finn harvest in the dark, their quiet, steady work a silent apology and a promise. They worked until nearly dawn, basket after basket after basket, preparing for the morning market. The market square had not seen such a crowd in years. They came from every corner of the town and the surrounding farms, drawn not just by the promise of food, but by the need to witness the conclusion of the story. They were a crowd humbled by nature and shamed by their own short-sightedness. At the center of the square, where a patch of sun broke through the morning mist, stood Alera's stall. It was not a stall, it was a mountain. Crates and baskets overflowed with the impossible bounty of the bottoms. The colors were dazzling: the deep purple of eggplant, the fiery red of tomatoes, the vibrant green of beans and kale, the pale, solid white of the cabbages. It was a portrait of abundance in a landscape of want. Alera stood behind the table, Finn at her side, no longer a half-wild boy but a proud clerk, a ledger open before him. She did not gloat. She did not remind them of their mockery. She simply stood, ready to do business. When the first customer, a gaunt-faced farmer, asked the price of the potatoes, she named a figure. It was so low, so utterly fair, that a murmur went through the crowd. It was a price that said, "I am one of you. We will get through this together." It was not the price of a monopolist, but the price of a neighbor. One by one, they came forward, their money clutched in their hands. They bought what they needed, their eyes full of a respect that was worth more than any coin. They spoke to her not as the foolish girl, but as Mistress Alera, a title of earned authority. Silas Croft was nowhere to be seen. His emporium remained shuttered, his absence a more potent symbol of his defeat than any public denunciation. Old man Gerhardt came. He did not buy anything. He walked up to the stall, picked up a single, perfect cabbage, and held it in his gnarled hands, weighing it. He looked at Alera, then at the bustling, orderly crowd. He nodded slowly, a deep, knowing smile spreading across his face. "You listen with your feet," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The land, she is happy now." He placed the cabbage back on the pile and shuffled away, his lesson delivered and fulfilled. By midday, the stall was empty. Every last leaf and root had been sold. The town was fed. The fear of winter had not vanished, but it had receded. Hope had been sold along with the vegetables. As Alera and Finn packed their empty baskets into the wagon, a group of town elders approached, their hats in their hands. The spokesman, the mayor, cleared his throat. "Mistress Alera," he began, "the town council has met. We were wondering about your ducks." Alera looked at him, her expression calm. "They are very good ducks, yes," the mayor said, flushing slightly. "We can see that now. We were wondering if you might consider renting them out next spring to help with with the slugs." He looked around at the other men, who nodded eagerly. They were not just asking for ducks. They were asking for her knowledge. They were admitting she knew something they didn't. They were offering her a permanent, respected place in the community she had built. Alera looked at Finn, who was beaming. She looked at the empty square, at the people heading home with their arms full of food. She thought of the 76 skinny, miserable ducks she had brought home 6 months ago. She had given them a home. In return, they had given her everything. "The prices will be fair," she said. And that was her final answer, her quiet triumph. That evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the bottoms, Alera stood on her porch. The 20 acres of mud were now a patchwork of dark, rich earth and shimmering canals. Her land. In the distance, she could hear the contented, evening quacks of the flock. 76 of them. They moved across the fields, no longer skinny, their feathers catching the last golden light, their bellies full. They were not just ducks. They were the answer. They were the protectors of the garden, the keepers of the balance, the living heart of the farm. The arithmetic of her life was no longer about scarcity and survival. It was the simple, profound, and deeply satisfying math of abundance. One person, alone, had become the center of a community, and the foolishness the whole town had seen was, in the end, the only wisdom that mattered.